So, what exactly is the land where the gods are, and how did it bring you to music?
Okay, it's a little tricky. I had a wife. I got married before my sophomore year of college to a woman with a 5-year-old child, and my wife told me she was tired of having husbands who were students. Her first husband had been at Dartmouth, and he'd been a student, and now she'd been through another 3 years of it with me, almost four, and I didn't want to lose my wife. And I didn't really want to go to grad school. To me, grad school seemed like an Auschwitz for the mind because instead of going into the belly of the beast and understanding those mass passions that made history, the passions that Hitler brought to the surface, for one, the passions where the gods are, I would be giving paper and pencil tests to 22 college students at a time in exchange for credit toward their psychology requirement. And how passionate are students? To what extent are those students going to show the kind of mass passion that showed up for Hitler's torchlight parades? Not at all. I was going to be ripped away from everything that interested me. So I walked in. I had been kidnapped. I had been kidnapped by the poet in residence, who told me one day, "Stay after class, close the door." Okay, I did. He said, "Okay, listen, you. I told you last year I wanted you on the staff of a literary magazine. You never showed up. This year I'm telling you, you are the literary magazine. You're the editor. You have the budget. You don't even have a faculty advisor. The minute you walk out of this room, it is you." So I went out into the corridor. I hated literary magazines. They look so boring. And I went out into the corridor looking very perplexed, and a kid stopped me and said, "What's wrong? Can I help you?" And I said, "I've been made the editor of the literary magazine, and I hate literary magazines." And he took me down to coffee and said, "Okay, now, if you could do anything you wanted with this magazine, what would it be?" And I said, "I'd make it a picture book." So I made it an experimental graphics and literary magazine, and it raised a ruckus. I mean, I started getting phone calls from the art directors at Look, and which was a huge, gorgeous, glossy magazine, and Evergreen Review, which was the leading publication for bohemians in the country, and Boy's Life. Ironically, I'd been thrown out of the Boy Scouts for incompetence in Morse code, and now Boy's Life, the Boy Scout magazine, was calling me to have a meeting. I was a student, for God's sakes. Okay, so school was over. I'd gotten out with, all these incredible grades and stuff like that. And I walked into the apartment of one of my artists from the magazine one day, just a brilliant artist. And there was no furniture in the room. There was wall-to-wall carpeting, that's all. And his wife, and his baby were all sitting on the carpet crying. And I asked them what was wrong, and they said, "We're being thrown out of our apartment. We can't pay the rent. The furniture's all been repossessed." And they're about to turn off the electricity and the phone. So I said, "Well, your work is brilliant. If I show it to a few people over the next few weeks, they'll give you work. Then you'll be able to pay your rent. And I haven't made a commitment for the summer yet." So I started taking out his portfolio and the portfolio of some of the other artists. We formed a studio together. And by the end of the summer, I'd gotten New York Magazine interested in doing a feature on us, but I hadn't sold any work, and I was frustrated, and I'm obsessive compulsive. So I like to finish projects. I don't like to leave them hanging in the beginning or the middle. So between Auschwitz for the mind, a wife who didn't want me to go to grad school, knowing that I was not going to find what I wanted in grad school, and realizing that, hey, there's this thing you never paid any attention to in your life, Bloom, called pop culture. You've never listened to its music or anything. But if you get in there, you may get into the belly of the beast. You may get into the beating heart where modern myths are made. You may get into the land where the gods are. So I called Columbia, or I wrote to Columbia University where I was supposed to go, and said, "I have a back problem." I have to admit that wasn't true. I don't like untruths. But at any rate, and didn't show up and continued working on the art studio. And then one day, 3 years later, writing, all the time writing. Because remember, Einstein had told me to be a scientific thinker, you must write. So I became a contributing editor to two magazines. One was called Natural Lifestyles, the other was an incredible, seminal underground fashion magazine called Rags. And I was finally being printed in magazines, 175 things I did for Rags. I became contributing editors to both of them. And one day, somebody walked up to me at a parapsychology conference because I liked to cover weird science, pseudoscience, and said, would you like to edit a magazine? Well, to write, I'd been getting up at 6:30 in the morning, writing until 8:30, then going off to the art studio, then coming home at night and working until midnight. And I said, yes, because the idea was if I were paid to be a magazine editor, I could write during the day and wouldn't have to get up at 6 o'clock or 6:30 in the morning.